doing recording. I'm going to do a quick just overview of social networks and health, just so we're all on the same page, so we can see where we're at and what guides this kind of work. And those of you who got to see the presentations ahead of time, again, I'm not going to go into this in detail because I assume you've seen it. But the basic, foundational axiom that drives this work is that it's kind of building off this idea of Peter Blau, that what social life is the connections between people. And if we really care about social determinants of health, I want to make sure like how the social world affects health, then at least a part of it has to be through social relations. And thankfully, the field has recognized this. Like this has been going on and growing dramatically over the last 20 years, and there's very little sign of it dying down. And I think that's good for us, and it's good for the future. And I think that we've done some good science out of it. Just jumping to the end of that presentation, I just wanted to highlight the breadth of this field. So the social networks and health field covers a remarkably wide array of things, right? Everything from peer influence and delinquency to the spread of epidemics to how hospital systems might be best optimized in order to share patients and bunches of disease models in between, right? So it's a remarkably diverse field, and that diversity, I think, is highlighted by the ways in which there are these different research clusters. On here, I've just mapped them out there. And each of those little communities has built into it a deep literature on primary assumptions and thoughts and so forth. And a big part of what this workshop is designed to do is to help us talk across these clusters. So you might have spent the most of your career in studying HIV. Someone else has spent their time in studying social support and aging. And hopefully by talking to each other, we can learn something about, say, how social support might help people with their PrEP adherence or some such, right? So being able to think about across the otherwise large subfield is part and parcel of what we want to do. Again, I can go through this a lot if people are interested in hearing my story about it. But the main sort of way we've set up the workshop and the way I think that social network analysis generally works is something a lot like this. And this is probably not unique to social network research. I've just added in the social network bits, which is that we all start with some kind of a basic research question that guides some type of data collection. Now, in reality, it might be reversed, right? Someone handed you data they've already collected and you have to figure out a research question, and that's fine. But as a general rule, then what happens is you spend some time getting to know your data and exploring that data. And in the network terms, what that really means is often visualization and making sense of your data in a very qualitative way. And then from that, figuring out what types of metrics can capture the elements of the data you want. And the metrics fall broadly under these notions of centrality or homophily scores or things like that. We're going to talk through some of those in detail here in a bit. And then that leads to modeling. And so this is what's guides how we've set up the course, really, is that we sort of go through the idea in this general sense. And again, if we had a full week-long set, we would do that completely. And we don't follow it exactly because of the asynchronous nature of this workshop. We assume that you're going to jump around to the elements you want. Some of our presenters have been, because of their schedule constraints, have to come in a little out of this sequence, and that's all fine. And I think, again, it's all part and parcel of making do with this virtual world we're living in. So that's the plan today. I think that, again, I could talk through a bit of these elements in detail if people are interested, but I wanted to just stop there and really try to stick to my initial idea that this might be a discussion more than a lecture. And so I'm going to open the floor there and see if folks want to start with key ideas or thoughts. And silence empties the rooms. I can pick on people if you want. Let's start with a simple one. There's somebody who has joined this group for the first time and are getting started in the networks and health field. What's the glaring hole, thing that just doesn't seem obvious or mysterious or something? What is it that does anybody have a question of that sort, of why we're doing what we're doing or what it is? Shannon, is that go ahead, Shannon.
I was just going to say, I think that some of it's just sort of the nuances that feel like it, it's sort of behind the wizard's curtain. So why iGraph? Why QGraph? What is embedded really mean in a component? How can I actually talk about what that means as far as structures if I'm talking about something besides people? Those kinds of things.
All right, so I think that that's a great way to perhaps kick off one sense in which we might get started, which is my joke is that networks are easy, right? Networks are just sorting and counting. I mean, that's really like every network algorithm you go through, at the end of the day, you're sorting something and counting the number of times you bump into something else. And then you need a denominator usually. So if you know what you're sorting, you know what you're counting, and you can figure out a denominator, you have almost all of graph theory. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's what it is. And so, for example, homophily is the number of people that are like me as opposed to the number of people who are different me on the sorted set of edges I'm adjacent to, right? So that's homophily. And then in terms of any of the package, and something like embeddedness and cohesion, and those of you that it sounds like a made up word because that's the idea of embeddedness is how hard it is to pull somebody out of the structure of a network. So if you were to imagine breaking a network at all of its weakest links, like that old game show, when you got to the bottom, that person would be the most embedded in the network. And we have this idea that being embedded in a social community means fundamentally that you know all of the unspoken things and ideas and beliefs and practices implicitly of that community by virtue of almost all of the communication paths will ultimately go through people the more often you are embedded in the network. So we expect then that if you're in a community that is health promoting, then embedded people will be healthier than those that are not. If you're in a community that is health disparaging, then being deeply embedded in that community is going to be a risk factor, right? So there's always this contingent nature of network effects, which is network effects are simultaneously a structural feature interlinked with some substantive feature. And so you see that when you notice the classic connectionist point of view, which is that I take on the properties of my neighbors in the network, either by learning or monitoring or direct diffusion if it's disease. And so it depends on what my neighbor's doing, right? And so embeddedness has this really funny feature, which is there is no uniform good or bad usually in networks, rarely. I mean, there are some empirically true things we've tended to find, which is isolates tend to be less healthier than non-isolates or something. But by and large, the kinds of things that we think about in networks are contingent, and they have this embedded feature creates health in the context of healthy neighbors and non-health in the context of non-healthy neighbors. And that might sound to the uninitiated a little circular, that we're saying that healthy people are healthy and non-healthy people are not. But what we're really trying to do is to say that there's this classic problem that economists have been worried about, since the beginning of economists thinking about things other than money, which is that there's this unobserved population heterogeneity out there that we can't explain by virtue of being white or black or old or young or whatever sort of bucket we put people into. And instead, it turns out that a lot of what we can do is explain that by virtue of how their character is embedded in these ties with others. And so that's what makes it possible for networks to, to kick off differences that you didn't see otherwise. And so when my economist friends yell at me and say, well, there's, you don't know about the selection part of this, and I say, well, it's better than ignoring the unobserved heterogeneity, which is characterized by the network. And so of the sins you can commit, this strikes me as the least of them. And so that's one way of framing the sort of why social networks and health concerning stuff might matter. And your other question, which you hinted at there, which is what package do I use and what piece do you use? I'm going to come out and say right from the beginning that I've been in this business long enough and I've grown enough gray hairs in this beard to not tie myself to any program or package mast, right? So those of us that remember programming in APL way back in the day are going to say that R is going to disappear and the rest of it's going to disappear. And so what you really want to do is learn the fundamentals and then enough of a package and a way of getting work done so that you can get your work done. And so for me, the best package is whatever package gets your work done. And my other joke about R in particular is R is like English. It's not the best language for anything. If I want to woo a new romantic partner, I'm going to speak French. If I want to cuss out her ex-boyfriend, I'm going to speak in Spanish. If I want to be exact, I'm going to speak in German. But we're all going to speak English because it happens to be the language we know. And so that's what R has going for it. R is the language that everyone is using. And so by virtue of that, we're going to take with it a lot of its inconsistencies and idiosyncrasies and things that don't go as particularly well, and use that as best we can. That being said, it's not a horrible language, right? There's a lot of things that R does really well. And the iGraph package in particular is pretty fast, and it can deal with really big networks pretty well once you get your data into it. And at the same time, it does some remarkably stupid things, like not carry with it an explicit ID indexer that lets you break the network apart in smart ways, right? So there's lots of things that are good and bad about these programs, and a lot of what the hands-on tools are giving us in the test scripts are our best workarounds of some of those kinds of problems to try to make it effective. Does that help, Shannon? Is that a good way to kick us off? Awesome. Did that spark any thoughts or ideas for folks?
We have another question in the chat from
Please.
Katie, if I could read that for you, Jim.
Yes.
So Katie says, I wonder how you introduce your network studies to other colleagues who are not familiar with the field. I often struggle with explaining why I'm doing network analysis without using any terms or jargon. I think it's hard to explain why structures matter, and couldn't agree more, Katie.
Yes, awesome. That's a great question. So I think the notion of why we use network analysis, especially when I'm speaking to non-network folks, I do sort of pull on this notion of unobserved heterogeneity, especially those that are used to the modeling world. So for those that are used to the modeling world, what they're used to saying is, here's all my data, and what I have left over is an error term, which is all the stuff I can't control. And then we assume that that error term is structured in a way that it doesn't have anything interesting in it. Then if you spend 3 minutes sort of studying networks, you discover that people's associations are very similar to the people around them. Their health behaviors, their political beliefs, their expectations for the future, all these kinds of things are highly correlated with the people around them. And so if you've forgotten that, at a bare minimum, your errors are no longer beating the assumption. So if all you've done through networks is correct the structure of your initial error term, that's added something, because by virtue of the fact of homophily, that people are like the people that are next to them, the errors that are observed in a data set are going to be autocorrelated, right? There's going to be this correlation with the things that are included in the data set by virtue of the facts of the people they're talking to. Now, that's a technical answer that is not very convincing to people who aren't technical, who aren't obsessed with those kinds of technical issues. And so the substantive issue is just to ask people what the difference is between a what and a who. And I think that what's interesting about social networks, and so in particular, is that most of social science is about sorting people into buckets, right? And so we have white, male, balding, bearded guys with a ponytail they should have cut off 10 years ago, right? It's a category of persons, right? And that category of persons we can slice down as much as we want, but you're never going to get the kind of thing that captures what it means to be an identity, to really be an individual. And what networks allow us to do is to pick up some of those elements. And so some of what makes a person unique is this pattern of ties they have to other people that you don't get in any other way. And I think that's really interesting. Now, there's a third version of that. And there's lots of ways in which that happens. So there's both a who do I know? Like, I'm a husband, I'm a father, these kinds of things, right? That are relational attributes that, in the philosophical limit are just another bucket. There's a different version of that, though, which is what we call this positional notion, which is that where you sit determines what you see. And this is a classic sort of organizational principle, but it's true in informal social relations as it is in formal relations, which is that if you're the kind of person that bridges different social worlds, you fundamentally see the world differently. By virtue of seeing the world differently, are going to behave differently. If you're the kind of person that's deeply embedded in a close-knit, sort of highly trusting universe, then you're going to think differently about the world than if you're a kind of person that has relations flitter in and out of your social world all the time. And so social network analysis is not like regression analysis. It's not just a technique. It's a perspective on trying to situate the humanness of people in the fabric of social reality, which is the thing that they're embedded in. And so if you really want to understand what human critters do that is distinct from their bucket of attributes, then you need to have some way of mapping this fabric. And so that's what networks do. Now, there is a third thing that sort of cross-classifies that sort of philosophical notion of identity with the technical aspect, and that's that networks can often be an incredibly efficient way to as a sort of a incredibly efficient policy multiplier by virtue of spillover effects. So if it's the case that I can treat you in some way, give you something that I want you to learn, and it's true, even partially, you don't have to go full-blown Moody on this, right? Even if it's just partially true that there's a spillover effect, the people next to you will benefit from your benefit, then because each of us has up to 150 close friends, if you believe the Dunbar number, right? Then it's the case that a small improvement in your health will have massive improvements at the population level, because that small bit goes out to 150 other people. So the fact that people are linked in a real sense means that if you can seed things in the network smartly, you can really do a nice job of having a policy multiplier effect. And so network analysis allows you to think about the social communities you're dealing with and say, well, is this the kind of community where it's best to give, elders the treatment, or is it best to give, mothers the treatment? And if you think about this in smart ways, you can do things that are different from a policy standpoint than you would otherwise. Does that help answer the question? I don't know who asked it in the chat, but
Yes, it's very helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Moody.
of course. So these are some great big picture questions. Anything else popping up as we move through this bit? The other thing that I love, please go ahead, Allison.
Hi. I guess something new that came out from your presentation was this idea of a different way of collecting social network data from like these events or these committees. And I never thought of it that way, of how you could create a social network maybe more easily without like serving the whole village, but using a different unit. Yeah,
so for those of you that, just to back up for a second, what Allison is speaking of is the notion of what are called two-mode network data, or bipartite network data. And I love bipartite data, because for this very reason, if you know what people do, and what anything you do with someone else is the basis of a potential network measure, right? So you can think people who've attended the same university, right? So if both of us have been to Ohio State, hi Keith, and both of us have been to the University of North Carolina, right? Then that leaves us a link between Ohio State and North Carolina that you wouldn't have to ask somebody, tell me everybody you know, and try to pick through and see if they've been in those same places. And so once you start looking around and realizing, just like, sans COVID and lockdown, if you were to go through a person's daily history and just look at all the places that you've been and how many other people are at those places at the same time, the implicit interaction network generated by the things that people do is just, as a part of their everyday existence, is just remarkable. And it's often easier to ask people about what they did where, as opposed to who they interacted with there, because we're kind of just better at remembering that. Or you can put it in traces if you have people's Bluetooth or those kinds of things. So I love those kinds of data. They carry with them certain elements that are a little bit weird, right? Because you have everybody who, if your index was what university have you been part of over the course of your career, then anybody who's been at Ohio State is linked to everybody who's been at Ohio State, right? So it creates these kinds of really big cliques that you have to be cognizant of in the ways of modeling that. We have a really nice presentation coming tomorrow by David Hunter on ways to use ergoms to model these kinds of networks. And so if you're interested in these, I encourage you to find it. The other things that's nice about it is that it lets us get out of physical networks and into cognitive networks, in that it might not be that you and I are the same because we've been to the same university. It might be that we're the same because we believe the same vector of things. And so if I ask you a survey, and it's a series of beliefs about the way the world is organized, I can generate intellectual communities or people that share ideologies and cultural schemas by virtue of the fact that we all overlap on the way we answer that survey. And you can do that with any survey, right? And so as soon as you have this, it's like, no way, right? Every survey, the GSS becomes the world's best longitudinal network survey for cognitive social structures. If you want to understand how people think about the way different things in the world are connected to each other, then any survey allows you to do this. And so it sort of creates a case-based approach, to use an old language, a case-based approach to networks, to surveys, as opposed to a variable-based approach to surveys, which is really kind of fun. There's a big theoretical sort of push on this, what's called the duality of persons and groups by Ron Breiger. Any of you that are interested in thinking about this, I encourage you to go and look at it, because what's nice about this, I've just been talking about this all from the person point of view. The flip side of this, of course, is that each time a person is connected to a thing, things are connected to other things by virtue of having people in common. So you get the duals of community. So the classic example would be something like the secondary association characteristics of a community and the people that are in it. You could look at people who share churches, workplaces, and clubs together, or you could ask, for any given community, how likely it is that these types of workplaces, these types of clubs, and these types of communities overlap with each other. So it gives you this simultaneous duality between the people that are there and the organizations they're involved in, and their structures are linked by this overlap, but that doesn't require really anything about them in most cases. And so you can get two visions, sort of Alice in Wonderland mirror visions of the same place, by virtue of taking a community point of view versus an individual point of view. So yes, I strongly encourage you to look at these kind of data. It's the topic is bipartite networks or multi-mode networks, and we will be bumping into those throughout the next 2 days. Does that help? Or are there other questions in particular on that? Once you get him rolling, he doesn't stop. Other questions about from the intro slides? I would encourage you to think a little bit. One of the points that Dan McFarland, Craig Rollins, and Jeff Smith and myself, who were finishing a new book on social network analysis, a new textbook, we try to frame it around this distinction between connectionist approaches and positional approaches. And just to put that in the back of your head, a connectionist approach is anything you can get via contagion, which is a lot, right? And has been most of what we think about in social network research. I've also spent a lot of time for prepping for this session, or this, these next 2 days, to try to think more deeply about positional approaches. And the idea of a connectionist approach is that I get something from the people I'm connected to, either a resource or a disease, right? Depending on what context you're working in. Whereas in the positional approach, the idea is to really think about the pattern of ties, often across multiple relations that people are engaged in. And so all of the models, and many times when you, at the end of the day, the model becomes the same. If I'm interested either way, I might be looking at something like closeness, centrality, predicting your self-rated health. But there could be two reasons there could be two theories that drive that. One could be that you learn about what's healthy and unhealthy, and that's a connectionist mechanism driving that result. The other might be that because you've looked around and you see the world in a particular way by virtue of your position in the network, that gives you an understanding of health that is different, perhaps responsibility or self-fulfillment or something like this. And so there's often different mechanisms that would underlie the same measure depending on which of these two approaches you take. So as you start thinking about social network theories for health, it's useful to have both of those in the back of your head.
Jim, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Talking about positional, have people tried to connect positional approaches to intervention studies? Because I mean, one sort of nice thing about positional approaches is, if I wanted to find these people and what the role is in this community, and I could find important people that might be able to influence other people, that would seem like a nice thing for an intervention strategy. But I actually haven't ran into that often myself, so I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, no, I think that the vast majority of interventions have focused on the spillover mechanism in one sort or the other. And so you often have these notions of trying to identify influencers or try to identify key players. And Tom Valente's work, for example, a lot of that work is to identify nodes that could then spread bits directly. I agree. I don't think there's that many folks that have tried to do this. It's a difficult thing to do from an intervention because it requires this two-stage sort of model of collecting the full network data and then going back and interviewing or intervening. Whereas a lot of the diffusion models now, we can do things like, I can ask Allison, who's her best friend, and odds are her friend is more popular than she is, just by virtue of the fact that all of our friends are more popular than us. on average. And so that then leads to the ability, if you want to quickly find super spreaders in a network, you can do it without having to actually survey the whole network. There's some good work on that. And so I think that we need to think really a little more carefully about how we could intervene efficiently there in a way that we haven't done yet. All right, so I'm already behind schedule. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then Leanne's going to come back and introduce us to R. So the next 2 sessions are introductions to the mechanics of doing network analysis in R. And so we're going to do that for the next essentially hour and a half. And so we will meet back here. Let's meet back at 10:35 if people need to take a quick break. So we'll give you 3 minutes and we'll see you in a moment.